People say that Rome fell in 476, but in truth it did not fall. It withdrew gently, quietly, piece by piece, no sound of shattering, no gates burning. Only me still here among arches, cold as ash and columns that cast noon's shadow anymore. I am not a hero, not the last survivor of some great battle. I am simply the one still lucid enough to record what no one else bothers to remember. Rome was not conquered. It was abandoned. My home now is a cracked roof, birds nesting atop a headless god. The Tiber drifts like it's half asleep. In the forum that once blazed with glory, only an old bell chimes in the wind. No one calls to anyone. No one looks toward the Palatine Hill. No one arrives, no one leaves. I once believed in the eternal empire. Believed that as long as the roads still led to Rome, everything could be rebuilt. But then one day, the soldiers didn't return. The governor stopped replying. Meetings were cancelled with no explanation. A stone fell from a wall. No one picked it up. A statue lost an arm. No one repaired it. And life went on, as if nothing was worth preserving. I walk the forum now like a ghost. I place my hand on the stone, hoping some memory might rise, but the columns are no longer warm. The marble no longer speaks. All I hear is the one thing that remains, silence. I do not write to be remembered. I write so I do not betray what I once believed to be eternal. If someone far from now walks this place and wonders what once stood here, I hope they'll know there was once a civilization called Rome. And it did not die from war. It died because no one believed it was worth keeping alive. I was never a soldier. I've never held a sword on the battlefield. Nor was I ever a high official seated in the Cura Julia deciding the fate of faraway provinces. I'm just a writer. Someone who lived by watching others act and tried to capture the things they never realized were happening. Some called me a scribe. Others said I was a useless man clinging to the past. But in the final gusts of wind sweeping through this empire's autumn, I've come to understand that sometimes silence is where truth lingers the longest. I once studied in Alexandria back when the great library still burned with light. I spent hours beneath the shade of Corinthian columns, listening to scholars debate laws, philosophy, myths, and how to govern a mighty empire without letting it rot from within. When I returned to Rome, I carried with me a quiet pride that maybe through the written word, I could help preserve the past from fading away. What I didn't realize was that once great powers begin to fall, memory is the first thing people are willing to trade for survival. I worked under a northern governor once. My job was to record news from the provinces, transcribe decrees issued from the court at Ravenna, and maintain tax records. I still remember the first time official dispatches arrived over 3 weeks late. Then came the day the courier simply never returned. Not because he was robbed, but because no one cared to read messages anymore. The local ruler began to govern by his own rules, issuing laws without permission. No word from the capital, and no one there strong enough to object. These early signs didn't spark panic. They were only felt by people like me, those who noticed the cracks like the way leaves curl when autumn sets in. I tried to send letters back to Rome warning that this region no longer accepted oversight from the Senate, that local soldiers were organizing their own factions, that the zinc-coated coins were becoming worthless in trade with the barbarians. But those messages vanished into silence, and then I realized something terrible. I wasn't just witnessing the collapse, I was living inside it. Every unnoticed decision, every quiet change was another thread unraveling the fabric of something far too vast for anyone to steer. Old friends of mine retreated to their estates. Some joined the church. A few fled east, hoping Constantinople might still stand strong. I stayed, not out of courage, but out of a stubborn, quiet resolve. I wanted to see the ending with my own eyes. I wanted to write it down, not the grand battles or the triumphant speeches, but the silences, the averted gazes, the walls turning green with mold because noon cleaned them anymore. Because in those forgotten details, history reveals its true face. People like to say that history belongs to the victors, but I believe it belongs to those who still remember, to people like me writing beside the ashes, who can still recall the smell of the wind as an army fled the chill that came when an ancient temple was sealed for the last time. The hollow echo of church bells ringing in a city where no one comes to hear their sermon. I don't write this to be praised. I write so that if one day someone stumbles across these pages, They won't ask why did Rome fall, but something deeper, something that stings. Why didn't anyone stop it while there was still time? And maybe that question, more than any epic or legend, is the only thing that truly remains when the light withdraws from a civilization. I used to think that if this empire were to fall, it would come like a flood, some overwhelming invasion, a great quake splitting the very foundation. But I was wrong. The empire didn't collapse like the Tower of Babel. It crumbled slowly, crack by crack, quietly and persistently, like a vaulted ceiling that seemed solid until it started to drip. The first bricks didn't fall because of enemy blades. They shifted because people's hearts slipped from the foundation of duty and wisdom. I still remember a local council meeting in a small province in Gaul. The tax collector, the military commander, and our merchants' representative sat together in a large wooden hall, once a temple to Saturn, now repurposed after the gods were forgotten. They were discussing the poor harvest and whether taxes that year would fall short. The commander, a man who had once served along the Rye frontier, scoffed and said plainly that the troops hadn't been paid in 6 months. They'd keep the tax money to care for their soldiers first. No one objected, not because they agreed, but because everyone knew that speaking up might mean waking up to that hall burning the next day. Loyalty, once the lifeblood of this empire, is now just a faded inscription on weathered stone. Local leaders no longer looked east to where emperors sent decrees. They looked north toward new, more practical alliances. I remember overhearing a young soldier say, "I belong to the land that feeds my family, not to statues on the Palatine Hill." And he wasn't ignorant. He was right. Back in Rome, emperors came and went so fast that none stayed long enough to understand what they were ruling. Power was seized not for ideals or stability, but for personal survival. Being emperor had become a death sentence, where danger came not from distant enemies, but from within the palace walls. And when the man on the throne commands no respect, everything beneath him begins to shake. Roman coinage, once a symbol of economic might, started losing its value. Pure gold was replaced with cheap alloys. The proud solidus of earlier times was now a thin plated disc scraped bare before it ever reached a merchant's hand. People returned to barter, inching back toward our premonitory existence. The vast trade networks that once linked Britain, North Africa, and Syria began to unravel. Roads went unrepaired, pirates ruled these seas, and no one held enough authority to guarantee safe passage. I remember traveling with a merchant caravan from Hispania to northern Italy, across treacherous mountain passes and deserted military outposts. Towns once bustling had turned hollow and cold. Bridges had collapsed and never been rebuilt. Inns were now just blackened stone columns stained with soot. The people no longer cared about the empire. All they cared about was whether there'd be bread tomorrow, wood to burn, and no unfamiliar man with a spear walking into their village. That's how the first bricks began to tremble, not from invading armies, but from within. As every piece of Rome's heart drifted apart, the cities of the empire became isolated islands left to fend for themselves in Asia of chaos. No one believed anymore that sending envoys to the center would do any good. No one thought the Roman uniform meant safety. In fact, Roman soldiers themselves had become one of the greatest fears among the locals. I write this as someone who stood right in the middle of those first tremors. I don't need prophecy to know the wall will fall. I just have to listen to the dust settling day after day. But what breaks my heart isn't the collapse itself. It's how willingly it was ignored. As if everyone could see the ship taking on water. But since it still floated, Noon wanted to speak the truth out loud. And that was the real beginning of death. The moment no one believed death was even possible anymore. When I was young, the map of Rome was drawn in bold, straight lines. From the western shores of Hispania to the deserts of Syria. From the Danube River to the sands of North Africa. Every province was connected by paved roads, symbolum of order, of the will to conquer. No matter how far they were, the provinces still felt like limbs of the same body. But as I grew older, those lines began to blur, like ink bleeding on wet parchment. The provinces no longer recognized each other. I watched it happen with my own eyes, as if the empire's body began to recoil part by part, forgetting it had ever been whole. The truth is, the provinces had always kept a piece of their own identity. That's nothing new. But the difference between an age of strength and an age of decay lies here. Once those differences lived within the discipline of Rome. Now they became excuses to withdraw, to deny, even to resist. When the emperor's authority faded, and the central government was little more than a name, the provinces began to see themselves as semi-independent states. Governors stopped sending reports. Local armies refused commanders appointed from Ravenna. Some regions even minted their own coins, stamped not with the emperor's face, but with local symbols. I once traveled to North Africa, the year the Vandals took Carthage. What shocked me wasn't the presence of so-called barbarians. It was the way the locals received them, not with resistance, but with a strange sense of weary relief. At least one merchant told me they collect taxes on time and don't rewrite the laws every 3 months. That line haunted me. When the people start seeing their conquerors as a preferable replacement for the old center, the moral foundation of an empire is already gone. In Gaul, many cities refused to send taxes to Rome, claiming the roads were no longer safe. They formed their own militias, set up city councils without approval from the capital. Small flags began to appear, not symbols of rebellion, but emblems of a world that had given up on the illusion of unity. That's when I understood the provinces didn't need to declare independence. All they had to do was stop looking to Rome as the center of anything. I remember a banquet thrown by a local chief in Illyricum. On the table was wine from local vineyards. Folk songs played instead of Latin choirs, and the host didn't once mention the emperor's name. Not out of disrespect, he simply didn't see it as relevant anymore. Rome, with its old temples, its senate, and its worn-out ideals, had become a distant story, like a forgotten religion. No one bothered to mourn. For years, Roman historians took pride in saying that the empire was held together not by swords, but by law, language, architecture, and a shared will. But when the provinces began building homes with local stone instead of modeling basilicas, when Latin gave way to native dialects, when abandoned statues gathered dust with no one left to polish them, I knew that unity had never been eternal. It only lived as long as people believed in it, and belief once cracked can't be rebuilt with documents. I once wrote, "Rome is not a place, it's a principle." But when that very principle is denied, when every piece of land begins walking its own path without shame, I had to face the truth. The empire died in the minds of its people. Long before its walls came crashing down, the provinces didn't declare rebellion because they no longer felt they belonged to anything they could betray. And that perhaps is the most terrifying kind of death, when no one even bothers to be disloyal because there's nothing left worth being loyal to. Whenever I tried to trace the deeper roots of our unraveling, my thoughts always returned to one name: Dionysian, emperor, reformer, and from certain angles, the man who laid the first stone in a fracture that would never fully heal. Historians often praise him as the savior of the 3rd century chaos, the one who restored order after a whirlwind of emperors flickering like dying flames before dawn. But in his attempt to bring stability, he unintentionally split the body of the empire in two, not to kill it, but to save it. The question that remains is this: was it a healing remedy, or the first drop of poison in the bloodstream? When Dionysian created the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire between 4 emperors, each ruling a quadrant, he believed no single center could manage such vast territory. On the surface, it made sense. New capitals emerged from Nicomedia to Troia, administration became more efficient, and armies could respond faster to uprisings along the frontiers. But when everything is divided for control, people forget how to think as a whole. Like a body where the left hand and the right hand no longer answer to the same mind. Once separation is legitimized, it rarely stops at reason. I once held in my hands a copy of an official decree from the Eastern Court sent to a Western province. Their recipient quietly folded it, set it aside and said, "This is no longer our concern." No outrage, no mockery, just a quiet acknowledgement that the connection had been cut. The ruler giving the order no longer shared our language, our laws, or our priorities. And when the mind no longer moves in sync with the body, decay begins. In the East, cities thrived, wealthy, populous, and anchored in ancient cultures like Greece, Syria, and Egypt. Constantinople became their new center, glowing with the mingled light of church and palace. Meanwhile, the West grew poorer, more sparsely populated, and Rome, once the beating heart of it all, turned into a nostalgic monument rather than a functioning capital. I once stood on the Aventine Hill, looking toward the east in the final days, wondering if anyone across the Adriatic even remembered us. Perhaps Dionysian never meant for the division to be permanent. Maybe it was meant as a temporary solution, an administrative measure to outlast the crisis. But history is never kind to systems that can be misused. His successors used that model to consolidate personal power, gradually shaping two Romes that no longer shared the same politics, culture, or consciousness. But from that point on, the Roman Empire wasn't one. It was two souls housed in bodies drifting further apart. Once listened to a sermon in a church in Ravenna where a bishop described Rome as an aging sister and Constantinople as a younger sibling growing in God's light. He never said it outright, but everyone understood. The time of the West was over. Priests, merchants, even mercenaries all began turning eastward, as if looking toward the future. The West didn't fall all at once. It entered a state of abandonment, not destroyed, just unloved, still standing, but only out of habit. And when the East, though still calling itself Roman, no longer reached out to save the West as it burned, I understood the divide was no longer something we could undo. Diocletian, who had once abdicated his throne and retired in peace, likely never imagined the house he rebuilt would split in two, one half collapsing in silence, the other surviving, but under a different name and spirit. In the end, it wasn't the division itself that frightened me. It was how both sides eventually came to accept it as normal. When the East looked westward and saw only a fading memory, and the West stopped speaking of the East entirely, then what we called an empire, even if it still existed in writing, no longer existed in truth. And in that slow dying breath I kept wondering if Diocletian hadn't divided. The empire might it have lived longer, or would death have come faster, but more whole? No one knows. History offers no alternate endings, only the silence of choices already made and the price which can almost never be undone. I still remember as a child how my father would take me to the Forum Romanum during great festivals. Under the sunlit sky, crowds gathered from every corner to witness the sacred rites, the offerings to the gods, the Senate's proclamations, the solemn grand procession of officials in ceremonial robes. Back then, I didn't fully understand what the rituals meant, but I felt something undeniable. A quiet collective spirit flowing through every gesture, every chant, as if the entire city were breathing in unison. But as I grew older and the final years of the old empire began to show their cracks, I started to see a colder transformation in those once sacred rites. It wasn't that people stopped performing them. They still did, but no one believed anymore. It was like actors stepping onto a stage, reciting old lines before an empty theatre. I remember the coronation of a young emperor hastily held in Ravenna. The priests murmured their prayers. Guards in red cloaks lined up with practiced discipline, and the old gods were brought back out to the colonnades, an offering to tradition. But in the middle of the square stood weary faces, hollow eyes, and an atmosphere I can only describe with one word: emptiness. No applause, no cheers, not even the birds flew across the sky that day. That emptiness didn't come from the rituals themselves. It came from within. When people perform ceremonies out of habit, not faith, the meaning has already long since died. Roman soldiers still marched with straight backs, but their discipline was a shell. Inside was doubt, the urge to desert, and worry about pay no longer worth anything. Religious processions still moved through the streets, but crowds only came for the free bread, not for blessings. Oaths of loyalty were still recited, but no one trembled anymore when swearing before the empire. I once witnessed an old-style sacrifice at the Temple of Saturn, once the spiritual heart of Roman belief. An aging priest held a goblet of wine, scattered incense into the fire, and recited ancient Latin verses like fragments of a forgotten poem from the Republic's time. But as he turned his back, a group of young soldiers laughed, spat on the marble floor, and joked. These gods can't even protect a grain silo. It wasn't blasphemy, it was disconnection. The link between ritual and life had vanished. The death of ritual doesn't happen in temples. It happens in the mind of a society. A people who no longer believe in shared symbols can't sustain collective faith. And without belief, even an emperor sitting on a throne wearing a crown wrapped in purple becomes just the shadow of power. And power once stripped of its sacredness is no longer power at all. It becomes fear. And when even fear fades, all that's left is a cold, hollow silence. I once asked a stonemason, his job was to carve imperial statues for the public squares. Do you still feel proud making these? He wiped the sweat from his brow and answered, as long as they pay me, I'll carve anyone. Emperor or rebel, doesn't matter to me. That answer, plain and honest, was the harshest verdict I'd ever heard for a system that was dying from the inside out. These hollow rituals kept going like plays without an audience, like prayers with no gods left to hear them. And I, standing quietly among the crowd, took a step back and wrote everything down, capturing the last echoes of a world that no longer believed in itself. Because once a civilization stops believing in its own ceremonies, it has already lost its soul. And without a soul, every statue, every scroll, every temple becomes nothing more than a dry husk waiting to return to dust. I used to believe the imperial throne was untouchable. As a boy, staring at the statue of Augustus in my father's museum, with his arms stretched toward the horizon, his gaze steady like a man leading an entire era, I thought the emperor's seat was something sacred, noble, chosen by fate or divine will. But as I grew older, as the empire withered through brutal winters and failed harvests, I came to a painful realization. The Roman throne in the end was just another asset, and like any asset, it could be bought, bargained for, exchanged. Sometimes at a price so low, it insulted history itself. In the closing years of the 4th century, I watched no fewer than 10 emperors rise and fall, not by the will of the Senate nor the voice of the people, but by gold. Time and again, the supreme power of the empire was sold off for piles of solidus laid on the tables of the imperial guard. Men who once swore to protect Rome with their last breath, but now learned to count coin faster than they could draw a blade. I remember one night in Ravenna, a young general, the son of a minor official with barbarian blood, walked into the palace at midnight, carrying a heavy sack of gold and a simple promise: crown me and I'll make you rich. By morning, the current emperor was declared unfit to rule due to a sudden illness. Within a week, the new ruler was crowned, and artisans rushed to carve new statues of his likeness. No one wept. No one questioned it, because everyone understood the crown was no longer earned through glory or noble blood, but had become the first item on the shopping list for anyone with means. When supreme power is no longer granted by trust, but by silver and gold, every concept of loyalty becomes fiction. The imperial guard, once a symbol of honor, had become a guild of throne merchants, ready to change sides for the right bid. Regional generals with their own private armies began to look at Rome not as a sacred center of power, but as a career opportunity. And the palace itself became the strangest marketplace in history, where crowns were sold not by posted price, but through whispered promises and hidden daggers. I once met an emperor who lasted less than 2 months on the throne. He was calm, educated, had written treatises on ancient Roman law. When I asked if he felt honored wearing the crown, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "Honor only exists when others believe in it. What I have now is a velvet-covered wooden chair and a room full of eyes waiting for me to fail so the game can begin again." Days later, he was strangled in his chamber. There was no state funeral. Rome had once been a great machine, with every gear turning in a precise ancient rhythm no one dared disrupt. But when the largest gear, the throne itself, became a toy in the hands of the highest bidder, the entire mechanism began to groan. An empire whose emperor is no longer respected, feared, or chosen by faith, but by bribery, is an empire that has lost its soul. But at the deepest level, someone once said to me, didn't rulers of the past also seize power through blood and betrayal? Yes, they did. But back then, men killed for the throne because they believed it was their destiny. Now power is passed around like collateral. No lineage required, no ideals, no loyalty, just the right price and a temporary agreement. And so the throne, once the symbol that lifted this empire to greatness, became its deepest crack, a place where even the lowest could ascend so long as they knew how to pay. We were once taught that the threat always came from beyond the borders, wandering tribes with no homeland, no gods, only the hunger to take. We believed that strong walls, disciplined legions, and Roman law were enough to keep every outsider at bay. But at some point, as the signs of collapse became harder to ignore, I realized something far more chilling than any invasion. The enemy wasn't waiting outside. They had been inside for a long time, wearing the clothes we tailored, eating at our tables, swearing oaths before our gods, just waiting for the board to turn. I'm not speaking of treachery in the traditional sense, not of traitorous generals or backstabbing advisors. What I'm describing was a slow, silent process where the line between Roman and other blurred, not out of tolerance, but from our inability to hold on to our own identity. In the barracks, more and more soldiers were recruited from among the Goths, Franks, Alans. They were strong, cheap, and loyal, until they had no reason to be. I witnessed it once in Noricum, when an entire regiment of mercenaries, barbarian-born, refused to march because their bonuses hadn't been paid. They didn't rebel. They didn't loot. They simply turned their backs and ignored the orders of their Roman-born commander. I asked one of them, "Do you no longer honor your oath?" He answered calmly, "I never swore to Rome. I swore to the man who paid me a simple reply. Clear, final, and the death nail of a military once fueled by honor. These barbarians didn't need to break down the gates. They were invited in. They didn't need to kill to rule. They were handed power. And little by little, they built their influence from within. Not through blood, but through absence. The absence left by Romans as they stepped back from the very roles that once defined them. In the army, in government, in commerce, in the church, foreign names began to appear, not as guests, but as masters. I remember visiting the estate of a regional governor in northern Italy. The man was a Vandal noble, spoke Latin with a thick accent, yet was called Noble Romanus because he'd converted and served the empire. At his banquet, he sat comfortably among local leaders, pouring wine and laughing as if he'd been born on the forum. But hanging on his wall was a sword engraved with his ancestral tribal emblem, not the Roman eagle, but a bare-fanged wolf. It wasn't just decoration, it was a statement. I'm here and I no longer need to hide. The issue was never the presence of foreigners within the Roman system. Rome had always thrived on absorbing others and making them its own. The problem was that Rome no longer had the confidence to absorb anyone. It began to tolerate, then depend, then rely. And the step from reliance to replacement is a short one. There was a time when Romans taught the barbarians to build cities, read laws, write prose. But now it was the Romans who bargained for half their land, begging for a few more years of peace in exchange for steeper and steeper prices, power, territory, and eventually even their identity. The maps weren't stained red with blood. They faded quietly as parts of the empire fell into foreign hands, and Noon raised their voice in protest. I once heard a Roman general mutter after handing over a fortress to an allied Ostrogoth unit, "Are we still Rome if we need someone else to guard our own soil?" I didn't answer because that question long ago had stopped needing an answer. And so the empire didn't fall from the outside. It rotted from within through invitations, handshakes, and increasingly desperate deals. When the enemy doesn't have to break your door down, but only has to be handed the key, perhaps the one to blame isn't him. I once sat inside the Cura Julia, the place that had once been the beating heart of the Republic, and later the quiet soul of the empire. When I was a young man, My father brought me there as if to a temple where the voices once echoed loud enough to shape the destiny of a continent. Names like Cato, Cicero, Scipio were still spoken with reverence, like immortal citizens of Rome's collective memory. But as the years passed, each time I returned, the air felt thinner, like incense long gone cold, like the ghost of a bygone age that never said goodbye. Once I attended a Senate session. It wasn't a fiery debate. It wasn't a place where rhetoric sliced through truth. It was a cold, half-empty room where weary senators read long, lifeless texts. Half the seats were vacant. The rest nodded half-heartedly, some drifting to sleep after too much weak wine at lunch. No hands raised, no voices rose. The silence wasn't obedience. It was exhaustion. An institution that had lived too long and now sat frozen in stone, watching itself decay. The real decisions no longer came from there. Orders came from palaces, from generals, from bishops. The Senate still existed like makeup on a corpse, a ceremonial gem glued to a machine of power that no longer needed it. And strangely, no one ever declared it dissolved. No one dared to kill the ghost. So they let it live, withered, ruthless, but standing because no one had the courage or the interest to cut it down. I once saw a young guard spit on the steps of the Cura. An older attendant scolded him, calling it disrespect. The boy just shrugged and said, "No one important meets there anymore." I almost protested, but I stopped because he was right. Not because the Senate wasn't important, but because we had let it become unimportant. Where were their debates on justice and order? Where were the cries of senatus consultum that once carried the weight of a civilization? Where was the belief that governance should be entrusted to men acting not for personal gain, but for the common good? All gone. All that remained were transcripts filed for protocol, copied into archives no one read. And then one day, I heard something that weighed heavier on my heart than any battle ever could. When a senator was asked how the Senate should respond to the Vandals taking control of the sea lanes, he answered, "We should pray, not speak." And I wondered, when had the voices of those once chosen to represent the collective will been replaced by silent pleas to the heavens? When did we begin to accept that we were only witnesses, not actors? I don't write this to condemn those final men in the Cura. Many were scholars, nobles, honest men, but they lived in a time when words had lost their strength, and none of them, not even the best, knew how to get it back. And when an institution no longer believes in itself, no outsider ever will. The last voice of the Senate wasn't a speech. It was a long, slow silence. It didn't end with a gavel strike, but with echoes fading into cold stone corridors. And one day, when no one convened, when no one waited, when no one recorded the minutes, then the absence of words spoke louder than any decree. A civilization doesn't collapse when it loses its armies or even its territory. It dies the moment it can no longer speak to itself. And for us, that moment came, and no one bothered to write it down. I remember walking into the Temple of Jupiter as a child, gazing up at the towering dome, where a golden eagle spread its wings, the air filled with incense, and the soft flicker of hundreds of oil lamps reflecting off-reliefs, carved with the empire's great triumphs. It wasn't just a place of prayer. It was where Romans went to feel they belonged to something greater than their own fate. The gods, whether or not people still believed they were real, stood as symbols of order, of memory, of a connection to our ancestors and the glory of our past. But over time, the eyes that once looked up to that dome grew indifferent, then turned away and never looked back. The rise of Christianity didn't happen overnight, nor solely through violence. It came like a shift in the wind. First came tolerance, then acceptance, then privilege, and finally dominance. When Emperor Constantine chose the cross-ashes symbol, he wasn't just changing his faith. He was reshaping the entire identity of the empire. Statues of gods were torn down, temples repurposed into churches, and ancient rites were condemned as pagan. What struck me most wasn't the change itself, but how swiftly people abandoned the old ways, as if they had never believed, never bled in those gods' names. I don't oppose Christianity. I've read the Gospels, listened to early sermons echoing in stone chapels, and felt the light of compassion, of a moral clarity purer than any law I ever copied. But I also witnessed something strange. When faith becomes a tool of politics, its deepest power begins to fade. Bishops were given the authority of governors. Those once persecuted became judges. And the empire in its death throes clung to the cross like a wooden raft adrift in chaos, hoping that a new soul might save its rotting flesh. I once stood in a church in Constantinople, where coloured light poured through stained glass, shining onto mosaics that told the lives of saints. The people sang hymns, knelt in devotion. It was beautiful, full of hope, but what unsettled me was the sense of familiarity, not resurrection, but repetition. A new ritual replacing the old. A new empire wearing the mask of morality, but still wielding power the same way. Emperors now claimed divine appointment, but still issued decrees, levied taxes, crushed dissent. Only now they did it under heaven's name. Rome changed gods like a dying man reaching for a new soul, hoping that if the old ideals no longer stirred the heart, then a new faith might jumpstart it. But faith cannot thrive in a body whose every cell has forgotten how to believe. Baptisms were held en masse for soldiers, officials, citizens, but no one taught them love, sacrifice, or forgiveness. Churches rose, but hospitals crumbled. Relics paraded through the streets while granaries stood empty. God was worshipped, but the poor still froze to death in the marketplace. I don't deny that Christianity brought a new kind of strength, a spiritual architecture to replace the myths that had decayed. But the question I kept writing in my journals was this: was the empire truly saved? Or did it simply swap masks on a corpse already decomposing? Because if the new soul cannot reach the heart, then no matter how loudly the prayers are spoken, they're still just echoes in a hollow sanctuary. Maybe Christianity did save Rome, but not to preserve it. It saved it to place it with a new form, a new power, a different idea of eternity. And in that transformation, many things were buried. Our gods, our language, our laws, our way of seeing the world. We stepped into a new age, not to the sound of trumpets, but to the tolling of church bells, ringing like a farewell to vanished era. I once heard a physician say that some patients don't die from their illness. They die from being treated the wrong way. Acupuncture too deep, medicine too strong, hope given in fatal doses. These two can kill what the sickness hadn't yet claimed. In the empire's final years, I came to believe we were the same. We weren't dying from enemies. We were dying from the hands that tried too desperately, too blindly to save us with reforms that no longer moved in the direction of life. No one could say the late emperors were idle. On the contrary, they issued new laws, reorganized the administration, adjusted taxes, reinforced the frontiers, fixed wheat prices, even restructured the currency system. But all those efforts, however well-meaning, felt like swimming upstream in a flood. The harder they thrashed, the deeper they sank. What terrified me most wasn't their failure. It was their conviction that just one more decree, one more restructuring, might revive the dying beast. I was once assigned as a secretary to a financial reform council in medial Lanham. For 3 weeks, bureaucrats argued over land taxes, exchange rates between bronze and gold coins, and penalties for peasants who left their farms without permission. But no one asked why the peasants were leaving. No one spoke of war, famine, or lost faith. They redrew tables and charts as if numbers could be written atop the corpse of a system already rotted through. One emperor, whose name I'll withhold, introduced a sweeping price control edict to combat inflation. It listed in painstaking detail the maximum price of bread, sandals, and wine. Sellers were forbidden from exceeding those rates. Punishment was severe. But within a month, the black market exploded. Goods vanished from stalls. And the poor, the very ones the law meant to protect, could afford nothing. A policy that looked perfect on paper, but was blind to reality. Without trust, there's no market. And without a market, laws are just prayer synced on parchment. Then came military reforms. Emperors strived to restore discipline, reassign troops, elevate loyal generals, but the loyal ones weren't strong, and the strong ones weren't loyal. They used titles, gifts, and land promises, yet guaranteed none of them. And once an army learns to put a price on loyalty, it forgets how to fight for ideals. The empire, once the master of its army, became hostage to the very men who bore swords in its name. I once recorded a meeting between bishops and the emperor on moral reform. They hoped to revive virtue, ban certain festivals, suppress superstition, re-establish discipline. But they didn't understand the people didn't behave badly because laws were lacking. They did so because belief was gone. When faith dies, no decree can restore ethics. These moral reforms became a hollow chant, like an old man shouting at the wind, not to blow through crumbling walls. I don't mock those who tried to save the empire. Among them were wise, honest, devoted men, but they fought an enemy they couldn't see, the exhaustion in the hearts of the people. Every reform assumed the empire still had the strength to recover, the breath to rise again. But sometimes the dying don't need another dose of medicine. They just need one final peaceful breath. Once an aging governor read through a new administrative reform edict, then sighed and muttered, "They're writing laws for a city that's already burned." No one laughed. No one disagreed because we all knew he was right. The final reforms didn't keep the empire alive longer, but they made it die slower. And sometimes the slow death is the most painful kind. And I, who recorded every clause, every punctuation mark, every hopeful proclamation, could only wonder, was it possible that the best we tried to do became the worst thing we could have done simply because we tried too late? The Roman Empire was not built by sword and spear alone, but by the written word. Our laws, from the 12 tables of the Republic to the refined decrees of the imperial age, once served as the spine that held distant provinces together, all gazing toward a single center. In my father's library, I used to pore over the scrolls of ancient legislation, where each word was etched like scripture, where thought was carved into principle, where a farmer in Africa could sue an official in Rome and be heard. That was a time when words carried more weight than armies. But little by little, words began to lose their weight. They grew thin like sheer curtains draped over eyes no one wanted to open. In the empire's final years, I copied hundreds of laws, decrees issued from Ravenna, Constantinople, Milan, sent forth with red wax seals and stately signatures. But by the time the copies reached the provincial towns, no one read them. If they were read, they were folded. If applied, it was selective. Most often they were simply ignored, like a voice echoing too late into an empty hall. I once accompanied a courier delivering a tax reform edict to a remote border town. We rode through cracked fields, arriving at dusk. The local official, a man who'd once studied in Rome, read the decree in silence, then asked, "Who's supposed to enforce this when the taxmen have fled? The soldiers are gone, and the people have no grain left to give." No one replied, because the question didn't need an answer. The law itself was already out of place. The decrees kept getting longer, more elaborate, more detailed, as if the more they spelled out, the more reality might obey. I once had to copy a law that filled 12 scrolls detailing the inspection of grain stores across the western provinces. But according to every official I asked, those grain stores had been looted or abandoned the previous winter. We were issuing laws for things that no longer existed, as if clauses on parchment could summon food from the dead. I also transcribed laws punishing superstition, banning pagan rituals, mandating festivals in line with Christian morality. But in the villages I passed through, people still lit incense for the old gods, sang ancient songs in springtime, whispered prayers beneath sacred trees. Not in rebellion, but because they had never read the laws. They lived by memory, by the seasons, by the beliefs of their ancestors. The laws to them, the words were as distant and foreign as winds from another world. I don't blame the emperors. I don't blame the men who wrote the laws. They were clinging to the last tool they had left, language. When the army no longer listened, when the people no longer followed, words became the final weapon. Soft, frail, but still thrown like a desperate man casting stones into a dry well, hoping to hear an echo. Someone once asked me, "Why do you still copy these laws? Why preserve them at all?" I don't know. Maybe out of habit. Maybe out of some fragile hope that one day someone will read them and understand that there was once a time when written words were the last thread holding people in order together. A time when a single decree could bring thousands to stop what they were doing. raise their heads and listen. But that time is gone. Now the laws are only echoes, not of authority, but of a world already broken that hasn't yet learned how to be silent. And I, in my small room by lamplight, still sit and copy every line, every word, as if I were recording the deathbed confession of a forgotten God, the God of law whom no one believes in anymore. There's something I realized far too late. Not through decrees, not through galloping hooves or shrinking borders, but through the eyes of those walking the streets. In the final years of the empire, Romans, whether merchants, farmers, soldiers, or officials, all shared one haunting trait: empty eyes. Not because they were blind, but because they no longer saw anything ahead. No more ambition, no more dreams, no more vision of a tomorrow that might be different. I remember the eyes of young soldiers stationed in Ravenna, recruits from distant provinces, standing guard at the gates, weary in patched up armor, their gazes drifting toward horizons where no battles waited. When I asked one of them why he had joined, he replied simply, "There's no land left back home. At least here I get to eat." I didn't blame him. No one spoke of glory or defending the empire or honor. Those words had been left behind, engraved on old statues and forgotten books. I walked through marketplaces once alive with shouting, haggling, vibrant noise, and found only quiet trades. No one called out prices. No one argued over taxes or quality. People sold what they had. Others bought what they needed. An economy no longer alive, just surviving. A society no longer hoping to thrive, just trying not to sink. I visited schools that had once been Rome's pride, where masters taught Cicero, Virgil, Roman law, and Greek philosophy. Now only a few students remained, scattered, and the teachers, if they still taught, repeated old texts like men in a fever dream, one aging scholar muttered to me. I teach because I don't know how to do anything else, but I know none of them will become anything. Words like that no longer shocked. They had become common truth, even in the noble houses I once frequented, places where philosophy and art once flowed over wine. The silence had settled like dust in a tomb. Sons no longer aspired to Senate seats. Daughters no longer dreamed of marrying into prestige. Everyone knew that titles now brought risk, not respect. The closer one stood to power, the closer they stood to betrayal, to violence, or worse, to being forgotten. I remember a friend who once served as a Senate clerk. He told me, "We used to live to build something. Now we live just not to be swept away." That line stayed with me for years, not as a complaint, but as a precise summary of Roman life in its final days. No one dreamed of expanding borders. No one debated virtue. No one wrote thick books. Everyone lived lower, quieter, smaller, as if by staying silent, fate might overlook them. Once I passed through the square where executions used to be held. A crowd had gathered, not for justice, but because someone had heard there'd be free bread. When none came, the crowd didn't riot. They simply drifted apart like a wave receding from the shore. No rage, no rebellion, no love, no hatred, just existence, a kind without a soul. And in the eyes of those I met, I saw the most frightening thing of all. They no longer believed in anything. Not in gods, not in emperors, not in laws, not in the future. There was no faith, but also no despair. They had moved beyond both into something colder, a state of numbness, of hardened hearts, of a death too slow to name. I, just a recorder, have no right to judge them. I only write what I witness. But deep down I know this. When a civilization loses its ability to look forward, then no matter how tall its walls, no matter how loud its rituals, it has already died in the hearts of its people. And that kind of death makes no sound, spills no blood, but is absolute like a lamp that goes out, not with a crash, but simply because no one needs its light anymore. I once believed that even as the empire faded, music and art, those things that needed neither lawn nor coin, only the heart, would remain like the final warmth left in a cold house. But I was wrong. One day I passed the theatre where I had once heard Latin choirs rise like waves, and I realized no one was singing anymore. Not because they couldn't, but because they no longer had a reason to. No more audiences, no more patrons, no more nights beneath the stars lit by flickering oil lamps and applause, echoing beneath domes. only dust on stone benches, and a stage as cold as the tomb of memory. We, the last Romans, had once taken pride in what made us different from the so-called barbarians. Not just walls and legions, but poetry, philosophy, music, sculpture. But when I passed the sculptors' workshops, I saw abandoned statues of gods, incomplete reliefs, and calloused hands that now made bricks instead of tracing marble folds on a toga. The artists still had their craft, still had the skill, but no one left to serve. No one commissioned gods. No one asked for the story of our age carved into stone. And when an artist is no longer seen as the keeper of glory, he eventually becomes just another laborer. Even our language began to fracture. Latin, the tongue of law, of philosophy, of triumph, now lived only in books. On the streets, people spoke in rough dialects patched together with foreign sounds. No one read Oid's poetry with the proper rhythm. No one delivered Cicero's speeches to young men. Even in the churches, sermons had to change their tongue so the people could understand. And thus language, the foundation of thought, began to dissolve like ash in wind. I once sat beside an old musician playing the lyre on the banks of the Tiber. When I asked if Hestill composed, he shook his head. No one needs music anymore, he said. People need firewood. They need bread. They need guards. He told me the choirs had disbanded. The churches could no longer fund sacred songs. And the young no longer studied instruments because why learn to play when you might not survive to tomorrow? The last time I saw him, he had sold his lyre for 3 loaves of bread. In the forum, once a stage for oratory, I now saw only vendors of onions and salt. I still remember the days when that place rang with debate about justice, about truth, about the glory of the Republic. Now it was quiet, not because it had been silenced, but because no one cared to listen. No one believed words could change anything anymore. And when words die, song dies with them, for both are born of hope. Even the religious rites, the final refuge of song, grew muted. Hymns shortened, baptisms rushed, sacred manuscripts copied carelessly, their melodies disfigured by the tired hands of monks. Not out of apathy, but because the monks were cold, hungry, and tilling gardens to survive. Spiritual devotion could no longer stand alone. Not when the body ached and the soil demanded hands more than heaven did. I once asked a poor boy, his grandfather had been a magistrate, what he wanted to be when he grew up. He looked at me puzzled, then said, "I want to survive. Not a priest, not a stage actor, not a musician, not a statesman, just survive." And I knew then, when a child has no dreams beyond staying alive, it means that civilization stopped dreaming long ago. Perhaps in the end, what dies first in a civilization isn't its walls or its army, but the trembling of the soul. When people no longer lift their heads to sing, no longer raise their hands toward the heavens to plead or to praise, then they are no longer the stewards of any empire. They are simply the tenants of its remains. There was a time when we drew the empire's map from the shores of the Atlantic to the Persian frontier, and we shaded it all in one color. Not just to mark territory, but to remind ourselves that from west to east, from Gallia to Judea, we shared a single breath, a single law, a single faith, a single ideal. But by the time I reached middle age, that color had begun to fade right through the center of the map. Not through war, nor through administrative decree, but through something far more elusive, a rupture in rhythm. When Diocletian split the empire, he believed he was dividing only its governance. But like the human body, if the heart no longer pumps blood evenly to both arms, one will begin to go cold. And so, the West grew cold, not just from harsher winters, but because the East no longer sent lifeblood. No more aid, no reinforcements, no more declarations that said, "We are one." I had a friend who served as a clerk in Constantinople. In one of his final letters, he described the vibrant Eastern capital. New churches being built, marble streets, scholars debating theology with a fervor, as if the empire had never trembled. He wrote, "Here, we don't feel like the empire is falling. Maybe that's only happening on your side." There was no malice in those words, but they struck me cold because he was right. The East, wealthier, more populous, closer to eastern trade routes, kept rising, building, dreaming of eternity. Meanwhile, the West, once the cradle of empire, withered like an aging father left behind in a crumbling home, while his children moved on and never looked back. The Western emperors sent pleas for help, but what came back was. Constantinople watched the fall of Rome, the way one might watch a distant mountain collapse. Majestic, tragic, but beyond reach. They had reasons. They tower fending off Persians, heretics, threats of their own. But deep down I knew, and so did they, that the break was no longer temporary. It had become the new nature of things. Even languages split us. While the West clung to Latin amid rising barbarian dialects, the East embraced Greek, not only in poetry, but in law, in administration, in the church. Even Jesus was now named in Hellenized form. Invisible walls were rising, not of stone, but of habit, of cultural familiarity, of the growing sense that they were no longer us. I remember the last time an Eastern delegation visited Rome. They entered the city as strangers. No one recognized them. No one welcomed them with warmth, and no one envied them. They brought silk, incense, and sermons from learned priests, but they brought no promises of unity. They spoke in more elegant tongues, walked with the manner of visitors in a museum, not allies answering a cry for help. And then, as all Alaric laid Sigeto Rome, as the Vandals marched through North Africa, as the western provinces fell one by one like autumn leaves, the East did not come. Not because they didn't know, but because they no longer felt that the survival of the other half was their concern. We were no longer one body, just two hemispheres, one building domes, the other patching tents against the rain. I once wrote in my journal, East and West still call themselves Romanus, but their hearts no longer beat together. An empire cannot live when its two halves no longer see each other as one. And from that separation, two different dreams were born. One dreamed of theology and divine light. The other simply dreamed of surviving the next winter. We, those of us in the West, looked eastward and still saw white stone walls glowing in sunset, domes sparkling like stars. But we knew that light no longer belonged to us. It was a different Rome now, one that no longer walked beside us, no longer heard us cry. And when one half of an empire stops listening to the breath of the other, it isn't just division, it's death. There was a time when the sight of the Roman eagle held high would make people stop what they were doing, stand tall, and fall silent in pride. The banner bearing the letters SPQR was planted across every conquered land, a declaration that here order had arrived, and with it, eternity. But as it grew older, I began to see those symbols scrolled over, toppled in storms, or taken down from a soldier's spear without anyone bothering to pick them back up. I remember clearly the last time I saw a proper Roman legion marching through the city. They passed the forum carrying their unit's flag, a dark red cloth with a faded eagle sewn at its center, frayed along the edges. The standard bearer didn't raise it to the sky like those before him. He dragged it behind him in the dirt, coughing as he walked, not out of disrespect, but out of exhaustion, out of hunger, out of despair. The banner still had color, but something had left it, something nameless. The sacred presence that once led every legion, like a god clearing the path, was gone. I passed through the old barracks, where once the insignia of proud legions, Legio Franco-Italica, Leo Exeminina, adorned every wall. Now only faded planks remained, rusted shields hung crooked, and the new recruits no longer knew which traditions they belonged to. No one taught them of Scipio, of Trajan, of the glories carved into marble arches. If they still fought, they fought for dinner, for promises made to protect their families, or out of fear of the enemy, not for anything called Rome. Even among civilians, the symbols became mere decorations. Coins once bearing the emperor's image were now recast in cheap alloys, smelling of raw metal, the faces worn smooth, sometimes by faulty molds, sometimes deliberately left blank. A merchant once told me, "They all look the same as long as it spends." In a world where no one remembers who the emperor is, whose face you carve into, a coin no longer matters. Public works that once bore stone plaques with names of emperors, governors, patrons, now showed only scratched-out inscriptions replaced with wooden signs scribbled in black ink under repair. No completion date, no names attached because no one wanted to be associated with something that might not survive until next season. I once visited a church where a half-faded relief hung on the wall, one side showing the Roman eagle, the other a Christian cross. When I asked a young priest about it, he said, "We haven't decided which to remove. Maybe we'll keep both for harmony's sake." I didn't blame him. He lived in an age where symbols no longer stood apart. Everything could be replaced, redefined, swapped until nothing was truly sacred anymore. When people stop believing in symbols, it's not just meaning that disappears, it's memory. Children born today don't know what SPQR once meant. Elders no longer tell tales of ancestral glory. And those who walk the streets passing monuments, arches, old squares, don't even glance at them as if they're just empty stone, not vessels that once held the soul of a civilization. Someone once told me, a civilization doesn't die when the last man falls. It dies when the last symbol is forgotten. I believe he was right because it was the symbol, not the sword, that made millions believe they were part of something sacred. When the eagle no longer lifts its head, when the banner no longer flies, when the legion's insignia is melted down to forge cooking pots, and then perhaps the soul of the empire has long since departed. And I, who once sharpened my pen to copy imperial decrees, who once stood in silent awe beneath bronze statues, who once raised my hand in salute to every passing flag, now only write down the scattered fragments of a world that no longer believes in itself. I still keep an old parchment scroll, a list of emperors after Diocletian. At the top are radiant names Constantine, Theodosius, Valentinian men who, for all their flaws, history still speaks of with solemn titles. But the further down the list you go, the shorter the entries become. The ink fades, the gaps between names shrink. Every few months a new one, every few seasons a new reign. And the most haunting part is this. I can no longer remember their faces, not because I've grown old, but because no one remembered them long enough for their faces to matter. They passed through the halls of power like gusts of wind, proclaimed in weary cheers, minted onto a few coins, sketched roughly into a forgotten chronicle, and gone as though they had never existed. No statues, no epics. No one spoke of his reign because he never really had one. I once witnessed the coronation of a young emperor raised to power after his predecessor was assassinated by his own guard. The ceremony took place in a cold palace, before a handful of awkward officials and a troop of exhausted soldiers. When he raised his hand to swear before God and people, no one applauded. When he gave his speech, no one listened. And when I looked into his eyes, I didn't see the light of authority. I saw fear. The kind of fear that knows the throne beneath his feet is a trap, and the man who will replace him may already be standing in the crowd. There was a time when becoming emperor was the grandest ambition of any Roman. Now it feels more like a suspended sentence. No one dreams of ruling anymore. They simply hope to live long enough not to be dragged into the next bloody succession. Even those who take the throne no longer imagine themselves the heir of Augustus. They only hope to survive the winter. There used to be laws governing how an emperor's name was to be spoken. Full titles, divine epithets, blessings from the gods. But in practice people called them by nicknames. The bald one, the man in blue armor, the one who died in the bath. And once the next figure rose, the last was forgotten. Not out of malice, just because there was nothing worth remembering. In the final Chronicles I copied, there are entries that read, "In that year, a man became emperor, but was killed the following season." That's it. No deeds, no origins, no decrees. No one wanted to narrate an age in which each reign was nothing more than a shadow flickering across a damp stone wall. I once asked a coin collector if he kept any coins bearing the faces of the last emperors. He shook his head and said, "Nay, they all look the same." No one wants to collect what has no story. That sentence landed like a final punctuation mark on a truth too plain to ignore. When the face of power becomes meaningless, history stops bothering to record it. We, those who lived in the final years, no longer lived in reigns, but in the silence between transitions. And when history is written again, perhaps entire generations of emperors will be reduced to a mere ellipsis between two great names. A grey stretch of time no one wants to remember. No one truly knows. No one grieved deeply enough to mourn. And maybe that's what happens when the throne becomes a spinning chair. Its occupant is no longer the center of anything, but merely the one being pulled into the vortex, not even knowing how he ended up there. Roman walls were once the symbol of the unreachable. They were not just stone, brick, and watchtowers. They were a declaration that this empire knew where its boundaries lay, and it knew how to protect every inch of them. The frontiers from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the limes of the Rhine, from the Danube to the highlands of Armenia, were once watched over by men who carried not only weapons, but a conviction that chaos lived out there, and order lived in here. But in the final years, as I passed through those borderlands, I no longer saw vigilance. I saw absence. Watchtowers crumbled, gates half collapsed, forts abandoned, weeds pushing through the stone floors where legions once stood. Not because the enemy had destroyed them, but because the guards had simply left. I once stood at a fortress along the Danube, gazing across the river where Gothic tribes were setting up camp. They didn't attack, they waited. They knew it was only a matter of time before no orders came to stop them. And they were right. A month later, the garrison disbanded. No supplies, no wages. The gate opened. There were no weapons drawn. No fires lit. One side walked out and the other walked in. I remember a brief council with a military official. When asked why reinforcements weren't being sent to the border, he replied, "We need soldiers to keep order in the cities. What good is a frontier if the center can't even hold?" It was a practical answer, and a eulogy for the ideal that had once shaped the world. The borders weren't broken. They were forgotten. No one redrew the maps. Noon kept count. Place names faded from administrative records. The names of guarding legions vanished from rosters. And the people of those provinces, they began to bargain with those on the other side, trading, marrying, sometimes even requesting protection from barbarian chieftains because they knew Rome had forgotten them. I once spent a night at an old watchpost in Gaul. Etched into the stone wall was a line Leo VII Cohal's third marked not one step back, but the last step had been taken years ago. The station's new owner was a kindly old Frankish shepherd who spoke broken Latin and offered me apple wine. He hadn't invaded. He had simply filled the space Rome had left behind. It wasn't the enemy who destroyed the frontier. It was the empire that let go. Not with proclamations, not with edicts, but with silence. Silence in the face of pleas. Silence in response to missing patrols. Silence when provinces cried out that they could no longer feed their troops. And when silence stretches long enough, it becomes an admission. The gates are open, and no one is there to close them. There was a time when every Roman gate bore the eagle and the proud inscription Roma Vigil. Rome is ever watchful, but now those words are buried beneath moss, and I, a mere recorder of things, can only add one more line. Rome has slept, and when she wakes, she may no longer know herself. Not every enemy comes with a sword. Some come with only a look, and when no one looks back, they know the time has come, and so the gates open, not with a crash, but with the quiet absence of will. Like every Roman raised in the old tradition, I once believed that Rome could falter, could suffer, but never truly fall. We were taught that the gods protected us, that our laws were superior to any tribes, that all roads led back to the center of the world, that so long as we upheld tradition, Rome would endure through storm and strife as surely as the sun rises each day. It wasn't just belief. It was the very foundation of our existence. But then, piece by piece, that foundation was pulled away. Not by war, not by disaster, but by our own hands. When we could no longer believe in what we had built. I remember the first time I saw a magistrate refuse to carry out an imperial order, not out of rebellion, but because he didn't believe the emperor would still be in power by the end of the season. And when I asked a merchant why he no longer accepted Roman coin, he said, Because no one believes in the face stamped on it anymore. Simple answers, but each one cut like Asmol's steady wound into the heart of an empire once built on trust. I saw priests preaching of God's love with empty eyes, not because they were liars, but because they were tired. They spoke like men trying to breathe life into a flame that had no oil left to burn. They recited prayers, performed rituals, but the sacredness they once lived for was gone. Religion, once seen as salvation, had become ritual without meaning, like a mother humming labis to a child she no longer believed would wake. Even in the army, trust, the one thing that made men willing to die together, had unraveled. Soldiers no longer trusted their commanders. Commanders no longer trusted the capital. Provincial governors no longer believed help would come. And the people above all trusted no one holding a sword. They watched in silence with eyes shaped by long years of surviving, eyes that had seen too much and had nothing left to feel. I once sat with a group of low-ranking officials in a southern town when a messenger arrived with news of an approaching barbarian uprising. No one panicked. No orders were issued. One man sneered. "Who's left to rally?" Another poured wine and said, "They'll pass through." And they continued their meal as if the news were just wind passing by. It wasn't peace. It was the exhaustion of belief so deep that people no longer reacted at all. The fall of a civilization doesn't always come in a blaze. Sometimes it comes through the slow erosion of faith. Every time Ascetizen stops reporting a robbery, every time a teacher stops lecturing because no one listens, every time a mother stops telling her child about Rome's glorious past. With each of those moments, a small piece of the empire falls from our hands. I once passed a crumbling bridge where a bronze plaque had once honored the emperor who built it. The plaque was gone. Only rust marks remained. A young goat herd asked me, "What did it say?" I opened my mouth but had no answer, not because I'd forgotten, but because I suddenly knew that even if I told him, no one would believe it mattered anymore. And that's when I understood. Faith doesn't vanish with a bang. It recedes like a tide quietly, slowly, until one day you look down and see only cracked earth where a sea once touched your feet. I used to believe that the fall of an empire would come like thunder, something cataclysmic, like the scenes in ancient tragedies. Enemies breaching the gates, the throne overturned, crowds fleeing through the forum like waves crashing ashore. But I came to understand that the true death of a civilization doesn't arrive with a roar. It arrives in silence, a silence so deep, no one even asks why things have become the way they are. I remember the first time a library was closed, not because it burned, but because there was no one left to copy books. When I arrived, the shelves were still there. The scrolls still smelled of old ink, but there were no footsteps, no rustling parchment. The librarian, an old man close to the end, looked at me and said, "No one comes anymore, and they no longer need me." Then he quietly packed his things and locked the door. No protests, no farewells, no record of it in any bulletin. It simply vanished. Then it was the theatre, then the public baths, then the great markets, then the assemblies, then even the rituals. No one ordered them to stop. They just stopped like oil lamps going out when the wick is gone. And what chilled me most wasn't their disappearance, but that no one was surprised. There was a time when every betrayal by a general, every rebellion in a province, every enemy crossing the frontier would shake all of Rome. Buildings would rumble with argument. Senators would convene through the night. Speeches would echo in every square. But in the final years, I watched people receive bad news like they would a passing rain. No joy, no anger, just a quiet retreat indoors, waiting for it to pass. Once I brought news that the Vandals had taken Carthage, a wound carved deep into our history, one of Africa's greatest cities fallen to strangers. I entered the council chamber in Ravenna, bracing for panic, but nothing. A few furrowed brows, a sigh or two. Then the meeting went on. Salaries, grain distribution, clerical disputes about funding a new church. Carthage, just a line of sorrow, quickly swallowed by administrative notes. I lived long enough to see the people of Rome stop reacting to the sound of foreign hooves. They would simply ask which ones this time. Not with contempt, but with habit. Because when you've lost so much, you begin to prepare your heart for the next loss. Not to resist it, but so it doesn't hurt as much. I once passed through a village that had emptied itself. No one had driven them out. No war had come. The well had dried. The tacksman had stopped arriving, and word had spread that the next town over had a church giving out porridge. They left in order, locked their doors, carried their saints, and what little they owned. I asked an old man, "Do you think you'll come back?" He looked at me and said, "Don't no one returns to where nothing waits." And I knew he wasn't just speaking of his home. Perhaps the most painful thing isn't collapse. It's when no one calls it collapse anymore. When people no longer distinguish between loss and routine, darkness has already taken hold. Not through violence, but through normalization. I, who once recorded events with dates and names, now find myself writing, "In that year, nothing happened." But in that, nothing is everything. The silence of bells no longer rung. The death with no mourning. The loss that doesn't need weeping. And within that stillness, I hear a sound only those at the very end can hear. The empire dissolving piece by piece inside the hearts of those who have grown used to having nothing left to hold on to. You once believed that even if every building crumbled, even if every law was forgotten, memory would remain in the estuaries of the old, in a mother's lullaby. In the games of children, I believed Rome would live on in remembrance, like a glowing ember buried in ash, waiting for someone to breathe it back into flame. But one day, sitting by a small fire with the village children, I realized they no longer asked. They didn't ask who built the stone roads beneath their feet, didn't wonder why the temple had taller columns than the newer church, didn't question the headless statues, the half-carved inscriptions, or the coins bearing unfamiliar faces. They lived among the ruins, as if they had always been there, as if decay were the world's natural shape. I used to tell stories of Romulus and Remus, of great emperors and distant conquests. The children once listened, eyes bright in the firelight, asking if the eagle really flew above the legions, if the Goths feared the Roman horns. But now when I begin to speak, they turn away. One says, "That's old stuff, Grandpa." Not with disrespect, but indifference, as if I were describing a dream that had nothing to do with the world they knew. And I understood that generation no longer carried memory, not because it was banned, not because it was erased, but because no one passed it on. Mothers no longer sang the songs of their ancestors. Fathers no longer told tales of Rome before bed. The priests no longer quoted Lucretius or Seneca in sermons because they no longer read them. And the teachers, if schools still existed, taught arithmetic and letters, but not history. Not out of contempt, but because they knew no one needed history anymore. I remember a winter's day when a child dug a small jug from a pile of rubble, its rim etched with figures. He brought it to me and asked, "Hun, Grandpa, can you cook with this?" I took the vessel in my hands and recognized the image, a sacred ritual to Mars, once holy. I opened my mouth to explain. But then I looked into his eyes, the eyes of a child born into hunger, sickness, failed harvests, and I knew what I was about to say had no place in the world he lived in. So I smiled and said, "Maybe for holding water." He nodded and ran off content, and Rome, a tiny ancient part of it, vanished in my own words. Perhaps forgetting doesn't arrive with prohibition, but when no one feels the need to remember, when no one asks, the storyteller falls silent. When no one listens, glory becomes dust. Not because it's buried, but because no one calls its name. I once thought I was writing for the future. But what if the future doesn't want to hear? If the next generation never asks, what once stood here, then what are these pages I write? They won't be burned. They won't be torn. But they won't be read either. And that more than destruction is true disappearance. Rome didn't die by invasion. It didn't die of famine or failed reforms. It died when the children stopped asking about it, when its existence no longer sparked a question, when those still alive felt there was nothing worth telling. And in that silence I heard a sound, louder than any funeral trumpet. The sound of forgetting peeling memory away one layer at a time, until all that remains is old stone, wild grass, wind blowing, and anime no one remembers how to pronounce. Each night I sit by the oil lamp in my cold room, manuscripts scattered around me, and I try to imagine the light of old Rome. Not the sunlight that once shone on white marble, but a deeper, softer light. The light of will, of intellect, of belief that humanity could live by order, by ideals, by honor. That light, I still see it. But I begin to wonder, am I the only one who still does? Because around me everything has dimmed. The chants have gone quiet. The processions have stopped. No more oaths from soldiers. No more crowds gathered around statues to pray. In their place, silence worn into the faces of those long used to enduring. The weariness in the eyes of the old. The hardness in the hands of the young. Even in the churches, once lit with rows of candles, only a few flicker now like fireflies in the last days of summer, lit not out of faith, but out of habit. I still walk the stone roads whose every crack I know. Each turn, each milestone brings me back to memory, where I once heard Asinator speak with thunder in his voice, where I once saw a legion returning in triumph, where I once copied the decree of an emperor whose voice was butresolute, but all of them are gone now. The walls they built, the ideas they upheld, the dreams they sweat for, live only in me. I once met a young man carving into an old stone tablet, not to preserve, but to erase the name of an old god. I asked him why. He said, "They paid me. I don't need to know who it was." And I knew it wasn't his fault. He simply lived in a world that no longer needed memory. And I was just someone hiding a small flame in the sleeve of an old robe like a man smuggling fire through a frozen forest. One evening I climbed the Palatine Hill, the old heart of Roman power, where palaces once looked over the whole city. Now weeds covered the arches, birds nested atop the statues, and wind blew through the colonnades like the sighs of a world no longer called by name. But I stood there anyway, not to cry, not to pray, just to remember, because if I do not remember, no one will. If I do not hold on to each small detail, the scent of sheepkin in a library, the sound of stone wheels over cobbles, the way light passed through the dome of the Pantheon, then it will all fall into darkness. Not the darkness of night, but the darkness of forgetting, the kind that kills without leaving a corpse. I have no children, no students, no one to read what I write. But I still write because in every line I light a tiny flame. I don't expect it to illuminate anything. I only hope it resists the dark that is consuming memory, so that one day, perhaps far from now, a stranger might turn a page and find not glory, but light. Not the blinding kind, but the glow of a small, stubborn lamp burning low in the heart of one man in a city that lost its light long ago. And I, its keeper, have no hope left. But I have not yet let it go out, because as long as it burns, Rome, at least a faint outline of it, still lives in the memory of one. I don't remember exactly when Romans stopped fixing what was broken. Maybe it was the day a temple roof collapsed and no one came to brace it. Maybe it was when plaster peeled from the walls of the council hall, exposing the bare brick underneath, and people just glanced at it before walking on. Or maybe it was when I myself sat writing beneath a fractured colonnade, no longer feeling that I was living among ruins, as if ruin had become the natural state of things. We were once masters of architecture, of preservation, of flawless order. A bumpy road was unacceptable. A leaning monument was reason enough to alert the emperor. But now, fallen stones from a facade don't make anyone look up. A leaking roof gets propped up with a tree branch. A broken hinge is tied together with a reed rope. No one complains. Noon suggests repairs. No one sees a reason to restore what once was. I remember one morning passing through a city gate, once a grand entrance into Rome, and I saw a long crack snaking down a marble column. The townspeople had hung a small bell to warn travellers not to stand too close. No one thought to reinforce it, not because materials were scarce, but because no one believed it was worth preserving as it had been. That was the moment I understood when no one tries to hide the cracks. No one is trying to preserve the illusion anymore. And so it was with the human spirit. The fractures in dreams, in faith, in memory, were no longer covered in pretty words. No one said, things will be fine. No one spoke of ancestral virtues. No one quoted the Golden Age. They simply said, we'll endure. And that was enough. Endurance required no justifications. I once entered a church where the walls were damp and the fresco faded, no longer cared for. A young priest delivered his sermon beneath the crumbling plaster, his voice calm, as though he stood inside a grand cathedral. And I realized he didn't see the cracks as something shameful. He had grown used to them, as had we all. We were used to uneven roads, to muddy well water, to bad news that no longer drew tears. Once I gave an old friend a letter, its edges blurred from water damage. I apologized for not rewriting it. Hesmaladen said, "No matter, everything's blurred now." That line, though light, echoed in me like a bell at midnight. Not sorrowful, just true. A truth we had accepted without needing to explain it. Even in the architecture of the soul, we stopped repainting what had flaked away. Conversations once rich in meaning had become short and blunt. Manuscripts once polished were now scribbled hastily just to be done. No one aimed for perfection. No one reached for greatness. We lived like boatmen on a dried river, just trying not to run aground. I once wrote, "Rome falls not when the walls are breached, but when noon cares to mend them." But now I revise it. Rome dies not because someone breaks it, but because no one needs it to be whole anymore. The cracks no longer need hiding because everything has already broken. And we, rather than deny it, have simply learned to walk among the fragments without cutting ourselves any deeper. It's been so long now I can no longer tell the difference between ruins and homes. Temples once offered incense to the gods. Now they shelter sheep. Public baths are places to press cheese. The Senate's great hall is covered in rough cloth to make a winter market, and no one finds it strange. No one mourns. No one feels lost. Because we've lived among ruins for so long, we've come to see them as normal. I once stepped into a blacksmith's house, his forge set up in the middle of what was once a marble-floored villa. The walls still held traces of mosaic gods riding clouds, goddesses holding laurel wreaths. Amid the red glow of coals and the tang of burning metal, I saw the faint smile of Venus behind a layer of soot. I asked the smith, "Do you know what this place used to be?" He looked at me, bare shoulders, damp with sweat, and replied, "Best roof in the district." Then he went back to hammering as if I'd asked him about a star no one had seen in generations. People no longer call these places ruins because to call something a ruin is to say it was once more than it is now. But for the children born in vaulted rooms among broken columns, decay is the present. They play atop repurposed tombstones as the steps. They hide toys in the hollows of fallen statues. And they call the shadow dome overhead a gutter, not knowing it was once the ceiling of a sacred church. I once watched a family hang laundry across the railing of a war memorial. They weren't disrespectful, they simply needed the sun. I saw goats grazing in the forum, where once orators changed the course of history. I saw a wedding held in a broken arena with silk tied across the bust of a forgotten emperor. No one mocked. No one protested because no one remembered how sacred it had once been. Some say at least we're still alive. And yes, we are. But there is a difference between living and living atop the bones of a dream. Once we Romans lived in cities that were poems in stone. Now we live in broken verses smudged off rhythm with no rhyme and no end. I do not blame them. I understand. When the cold rains of January creep in, when the wind cuts through torn tents, then even a shattered dome is better than none. When hunger comes, a flattened tombstone makes a good table. When no one tells the stories anymore, nothing feels sacred. And what was once sacred, if not fed by memory, dies like a candle, never ray-it. I, a writer, a keeper of memory, once believed that when a temple became a storage shed, a part of the empire's soul was stolen. But now I wonder, can you lose what you no longer see? And if all that's left of Rome is stone, mortar and doorways, does it really matter if someone cooks dinner atop the mosaic floor? No one calls it an empire anymore. No one remembers the emperor who built the gate. No one cares if a column is Corinthian or Doric. People simply live like moss creeping up old walls, like birds nesting under collapsed arches, like humans learning to use ruins as if they had never been anything else. And in that life, I realized Rome wasn't destroyed. It was redefined. No longer a light that shone upon the world, but a patch of shade just enough to shield those who no longer needed dreams. There was once a time when Romans lived by the rhythm of the cosmos, guided by the stars and the rules of the gods. Every season had a name, every month a deity, every day its own ritual. We knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to bathe, when to fast. We counted days the way a builder counts each nail in the architecture of the world carefully, steadily, faithfully. But now, no one speaks of the Kende or the Noni or the Eides. The stone calendars are covered in moss. The bronze plaques in the forums rusted and unreadable. No trumpets mark the solstice. No lanterns light the Saturnalia. Winter comes not through ceremony, but through wind slipping between the stones, through frost clinging to broken domes, through a cold without name, without warning, creeping in like a moonless night. I once asked an old woman what day it was. She smiled faintly and said, "It's the day after yesterday." What seemed like a jest was in fact a truth. For many around me, time has no shape, no boundary between month and year. No one hosts anything at season's turn. No one says the festival is near because every festival has fallen silent. Every bell has stopped. Every calendar has ceased to matter. I still remember the last winter I saw a procession of fire around the city. They carried small flames, sang old songs, pleaded with the gods for protection. The next year, no one did it again. One man said, "The nights are too long. The fire doesn't warm enough." So, people stayed indoors, burning whatever they could find. And winter, once a symbol of reflection, of cleansing, became a stranger, knocking at the door uninvited. I still write my journals. I still mark the date, counting from the last harvest. But I know these numbers mean nothing to anyone but me. The children don't learn the names of the months. They say instead, when the leaves fall, when the river swells, when the cold bites most. Time has returned to instinct like it did in the beginning. Not a system of civilization, but a sensation, like skin knowing frost, like a stomach knowing hunger, like eyes knowing when the night has come. Even the churches have fallen quiet. The holy days are shortened. No lines for bread. The old priests no longer recall which sermon fits which month. They speak whatever remains in memory, any passage, any verse that still carries warmth. If there is anyone left to listen. I used to think an empire could lose its land, its armies, even its emperor, but as long as it kept its calendar, it kept its order. But now I see when the calendar fades, when winter arrives and no one asks, "What day is it?" That is, when everything has truly dissolved, not with the roar of a storm, but within the minds of men, a quiet unraveling. Winter no longer announces itself because no one is waiting for it. Time no longer rings because no one needs reminding. And I, who once lived by the pulse of the Roman calendar, no longer count. I simply write, "Today is colder than yesterday," and hope that tomorrow there will be enough light left to see one more line in a story no one is counting chapters in anymore. We once believed in promises. They were sacred, needing no inscription in stone. When an emperor vowed to feed the army through the next season, we believed. When the church promised prayers for good harvests, the people brought offerings to the fields. When priests read prophecies that light would return, we looked to the horizon without doubt. Promises were the thread that held the empire's fragments together, woven into something called hope. But that thread has rotted away, and all that remains is the echo, hollow, weightless, unable to hold anything anymore. I still remember the promise of a young emperor raised to the throne amid tired applause. He stood on the balcony, arm raised, voice from the cold, declaring he would restore food supply, pay the soldiers, rebuild the roads. People clapped, not because they believed, but because it was familiar. A year later, he was murdered in his bath. No one cried. No one asked, "What of those promises?" Because everyone already knew they were words meant to be said, not kept. The priests still preached that God loves the poor, that justice will come for the righteous. But when an old mother buried her only son dead from fever, unbed, unburied, she did not riot. She made no demands. She simply laid him beneath the statue of our saint and whispered, "God must be busy, not in anger, not in expectation, just a quiet acknowledgement that promises are easy, but keeping them is no longer within human reach." I once read a decree stating that every citizen would be protected from raiders, that commanders must defend the borders at all costs. But when my village was looted in a night of rain, no soldiers came, no officials inquired, no map was updated, no complaints were filed, no court summoned, no signs were raised. Because when promises break too many times, people learn to live without them. Even children no longer listen to promises. No one tells them they'll attend good schools if they behave. No one says that prayers will ease the cold. They grow up among words that once meant something, now passing like rain through a broken dome, echoing for armament, then gone. I once told a young man that in another time a single word from the emperor could make thousands line up. He laughed. Now no one has enough gold to make me queue. It wasn't contempt. It was clarity that words lose their worth when no one remembers how to keep them. Even I, who have spent nearly a lifetime recording vows and decrees, now write without the illusion that anyone will fulfill what I document. If my manuscripts survive, they may one day be found beneath stone in the ruins of some forgotten place. And when someone reads the lines, the emperor promises, I hope they understand. What mattered was not the promise, but that there was once an age that believed in them. When a civilization stops keeping its word, it loses more than trust. It loses the spiritual order that once held it together. Not everyone lied, but when even the honest no longer dare to promise, then language itself has been hollowed out. And so we live, not because promises remain, but because we no longer expect them. Our maturity isn't measured by virtue, but by how much silence we can bear when nothing happens. No one revolts, no one demands. We simply pull our hands back and learn to warm ourselves without the collective fire of hope. When the last promise is broken, we understand what's left is silence. Not bitter, not mournful, just empty. I once believed that when night fell, the first instinct of humankind was to seek light. That fire, even just a single glowing ember, would always be protected, passed on, kept alive by someone who remembered its worth. But there came a moment when I began to understand. The flame can die, not because the wood runs out, but because no one sees it as important anymore. My village once had a public hearth, each evening the elderly, children, mothers with buckets, carpenters with aching shoulders, all gathered around it. No one needed to speak. The warmth was enough. Stories, lullabies, quiet laughter would follow. The fire between people, but one winter day no one lit it. The old had passed. The young were too busy. Firewood had become scarce. No one said, don't light it. But no one said, we still need the fire. And so it faded. No complaints, no grief, just a circle of cold ash in the courtyard. I walk through old squares, once strung with ribbons for harvest festivals, once lit by glowing oil lamps. Now the stone walls are coated with moss, the cords are frayed, the lamps long empty. Not because light was forbidden, no one forbade light. But when no one expects a celebration, noon organizes one, no one sings, light has no one left to serve. I remember one December night. I lit a small candle on the windowsill. A child passing by stopped, stared at the flickering light, and asked, "What's it for, Grandpa?" I replied, "Because the night feels too long." He paused for a moment and said, "I'm used to it." His voice was soft, but in my chest it cracked like stone. I don't blame him. He spoke the truth. A whole generation has grown up in the dark and learned to walk with open eyes, to move without expecting a path lit before them, to accept the cold without longing for the fire. And when an entire generation no longer feels the absence of light, then even the very idea of light begins to fade. In the old monasteries, the sanctuary lamps grow dim. Young monks learn narration oil. Prayers are shortened. The Christmas night vigils, once glowing with hundreds of candles, now flicker with just a few, bending in the draught. Sometimes the wind snuffs them out, and no one rises to relight them. Even within me, the one who once believed in tending the flame, there are moments I wonder, who am I lighting it for? For whom do I keep it alive? Is anyone still coming to sit beside it? Does anyone still feel its warmth? Does anyone still believe that in the middle of the night, a single light could mean salvation? Perhaps not. But what moves me to write these words is not sorrow, but stillness. A stillness so long, so unbroken that it smooths everything down like ice on a winter lake. No rebellion, no trembling, no hope, but also no despair, just quiet. And I realize now when the fire goes out, and no one tends it again, the Empire is no longer a living thing, but a shadow in memory, retreating from the physical world, becoming the final breath of an age that once believed it was eternal. We no longer live to reignite anything. We simply live like ash,